Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Coordinated Assistance to States Reducing Isolation in Youth Facilities webinar series. My name is Mike Dempsey, and I'm the Executive Director for the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, also known as CJCA. Also on the call today is Sharon Pett, who is the Project Manager for the Reducing Isolation in Youth Facilities Initiative. Today's webinar focuses on applying positive youth development strategies to reduce the use of isolation and ensure youth safety. We also have Darlene Conroy and Jonah Shenham, who are helping with the technical aspects of this program from the CJC office in Braintree, Massachusetts. For those of you who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the youth juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various other major metropolitan counties across the country. The Center for Coordinated Assistance to States was developed in 2014 with a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP. The purpose of the center is to assess the need for and coordinate the training and technical assistance designed to build capacity within the states, territories, tribal units, and communities to maximize the effectiveness of juvenile justice systems to the benefit of the youth they serve. The focus of the center is to provide ongoing coaching to achieve individual and/or behavioral changes to positively impact the juvenile justice system. Joining OJJDP as partners on this project is the American Institute of Research in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University, also in Washington, D.C. With that, I'm going to turn to Jonah to provide everyone with a few housekeeping items, and then I'll come back and do our introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Just a couple of quick housekeeping points before we get started here. Everyone will be muted for this webinar. However, you can type questions at any time using the question panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And for your questions, if you'd like to direct them at a particular presenter, either Shannon or Ruth, please just indicate that in your question. The webinar is being recorded. Link to the audio recording, video and PowerPoint presentation will be sent out following the webinar. And I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you, Jonah. I'd like to begin by introducing the two presenters for today's program. We have Shannon Myrick, who is the Development Implementation Manager for the Oregon Youth Authority, and Ruth Rovezzi, Deputy Commissioner of Operations for the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services. I want to thank you both for being here and sharing your knowledge with us today on this important topic. I very much appreciate the time and effort it takes you in preparing your presentations for today's webinar. A couple of quick objectives for today. First is to understand the basic tenets of positive youth development, to understand adolescent brain development, to understand the critical role of staff to youth relationships in preventing the use of isolation, and to provide participants with concrete strategies for helping staff feel confident and capable of managing negative youth behaviors without the use of isolation, and finally, to provide steps to consider when implementing new strategies to shift the facility and/or agency culture towards using alternative tools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to begin the presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike. And on behalf of Ruth and myself, it's really a pleasure to be able to share this time with you all today and discuss some of the lessons learned and strategies from Oregon and Massachusetts that will hopefully be helpful in the work that you're doing in your states. I wanted to start our session today by just talking a little bit about positive youth development generally. And fortunately, in the juvenile justice field, this is an area where we're increasing our awareness and knowledge every day. If we look back historically about positive youth development, we know that it's grounded in decades of research. We can look to organizations such as 4-H, the Search Institute, and these folks are showing us what works for supporting positive youth development in any kid. It also requires an approach of working with young people that focuses on their development, not just their problems and deficits. And if you're in a juvenile justice setting, it can become very easy to find ourselves looking at the behaviors that brought kids into our offices, into our facilities, and to our attention. And if we're only focusing on problems, that may lead us to missing critical opportunities for supporting their development and growth. Positive youth development is also a comprehensive way of thinking about the development of adolescents and the factors that help them develop successfully. And you can kind of think about this as supporting youth in reaching their full potential. What is it that we need to do as the adults in their lives that are working with them at this particular point in time that's going to help successfully transition these young people into young adulthood? It can become a little tricky when we start thinking about positive youth development in a juvenile justice setting. And many of the organizations that Mike mentioned in his introduction, as well as individuals like Dr. Jeff Butts, have spent quite a bit of time thinking about what PYD looks like for a juvenile justice setting. And in Oregon, we've had some conversations that kind of really led us to these 3 bullet points, which is first, that it requires that we believe that youth can be accountable and strengthened at the same time. And to take that a step further, this strengthening may very well be the most important part of supporting that youth in desisting from future crime. So finding that balance between accountability for youth and strengthening for youth is really the kind of the crux of PYD in a juvenile justice setting. It also requires that we understand it's not just something we do to youth, but something that we do with them. This requires us to remember and believe and kind of own that youth are active participants in their own development. So when we can capitalize on that active participation, we're actually doing it with them, not to them or for them. And lastly, it views youth as resources to develop, not problems to be fixed. And this really requires that we change our lens. And when we change our lens on kids, that in fact you're a resource to be developed and not just a problem to be fixed, it really requires that we change our approach. It might be helpful at this point to differentiate between positive youth development and positive youth outcomes. There's lots of research out there about the types of outcomes that indicate healthy and optimal development for kids. Some of those positive outcomes can be categorized as youth being healthy and confident, physically and emotionally safe, connected and engaged, and educated and work ready. And these are the outcomes that all of us strive to see in the youth that we're working with in our settings. Positive youth development really refers to the strategies that we're going to use to get to those outcomes. So the strategies we use to work with youth that drive that thriving and create opportunities for the development of those outcomes. It really becomes a philosophy, again, that youth are resources to be developed. I'd like to share for just a little bit about the approach that Oregon has taken. And as Mike mentioned in his introduction, one of our goals for today is to take a look at healthy brain development and understand what that means for our work. I'd also like to talk a little bit about people and how the people in our environments matter in our development, and talk a little bit about environments. And Ruth is going to be sharing in the second half of our presentation this morning some of the very practical, tangible strategies and lessons that they've learned in Massachusetts as they've implemented these types of approaches. So we'll start with brain development. And the last few decades have been so important in understanding how the brain develops and what the differences are between an adolescent brain and an adult brain. And I'm confident that many folks who are joining us on this webinar today are familiar with this research and maybe have even thought about what it might mean for our work. Today, I wanted to spend time just on 2 parts of the brain that seem to be pretty important for understanding how we work with the kids that come into our systems. And the first is the amygdala. This is the emotional command center of the brain. It's the seat of the emotions. If you've ever felt that moment where you're like, "Ooh, I'm about to lose my temper," then you know your amygdala is fully functioning. And the interesting part of the brain is that this develops way earlier than the prefrontal cortex. In fact, it's with us our whole lives. And you know that if you have anyone under the age of 3 that you have told no to when they really, really wanted something, you undoubtedly know that that amygdala is fully functioning. The second part of the brain that I wanted to talk about with you today is the prefrontal cortex. And that's kind of that frontal lobe region of our brain, the judgment region. And it helps us to reason, decision make, and exercise some control over those intense emotions that we're feeling. And through tools like functional MRI imaging and some very sophisticated neuroscience, we're able to discover in the last few decades that that region of the brain is still developing and may not be fully functioning and kind of completed its development until our mid-20s. Well, that captures a huge portion of the kids that we might be working with, where we can recognize that they have fully functioning emotional systems and maybe don't have the capacity to reason, control, and self-regulate some of their impulses based on those emotions. So when we start to understand that we're in fact dealing with a brain that doesn't quite function the way our brains function, it can inform our practice and how we might approach them. I think another layer that's important for a conversation about reducing the use of isolation in facilities is complex trauma. And again, our field is becoming ever more educated about complex trauma for the youth that we're serving. So some of this may feel new for you, and some of you may be familiar with these concepts. I wanted to define complex trauma, and it's been defined as exposure to traumatic stressors at an age or in a context that compromises that child's secure attachment with a primary caregiver and also compromises their ability to self-regulate their emotions. And the research will suggest that youth who've been exposed to toxic stress and complex trauma actually experience an increased risk of delinquency. So it could be said then that many of the youth who come into the juvenile justice system may have experienced forms of toxic stress and complex trauma. But how does that actually impact their behavior? So let's explore that for just a moment. The exposure to complex trauma, the research will suggest we're likely to see increases in stress reactivity in youth, demonstrations of anger, impulsive behavior. And at the same time that we're seeing an increase in these challenging behaviors, we're also seeing a decrease in the youth's ability to inhibit those reactions and a decrease in their ability to engage in effective problem solving. And if you've worked in a facility with youth who are experiencing these kinds of things, you know on the day-to-day basis that they're truly struggling to maintain their behavior in that type of setting. And so if we think about how we're going to respond to that, we can respond to that with this awareness of not only brain development, but also how trauma might be playing a role in what we're seeing. And that brings me to People Matter and the importance of our staff and our frontline staff in particular, those who are providing direct service to the youth that we're working with. Those become the most important change agents in a young kid's life. Humans need connection. We know this. And when you look at the research about why connection is so important, it's because those caring and supportive relationships help build resiliency in young people. And resiliency is an important factor in being able to maintain a life that is safe, productive, and crime-free. Also, when we have a sense of social support, it helps us build our strengths. We have a place to grow from, and growth occurs when we feel valued by the people in our environment, and particularly those adults that we have established a relationship with. And the interesting part about human connection is that it may not ever need to be used that much. That is to say, sometimes just knowing that you have a person to go to who would be able to provide the care, support, and value that you need is enough. Just knowing that it's there is enough. You may not even need to access it in order to have the benefit of it. So knowing that people are so important to how we grow and develop, particularly for young people, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Erik Erikson's theory. So maybe you have to dig back to your intro psych class that you might have taken at some point in your educational career, or maybe you're a total psychology geek, so you know all about this stuff. But I think it's important for us to recognize what's happening psychosocially for the young people that we're working with. So what's up with teens and young adults? According to Erik Erikson, there are tasks that we have to kind of manage and deal with and resolve throughout our lives. And each of these tasks build upon one another. Interestingly, how you resolve one task is sort of carried forward into how you process the next task. So if you look at the graphic on the right side of our screen, you can see teenagers are in a place of trying to figure out who they are. What's my identity? What's my role? They're forming that identity. They're developing a sense of self and autonomy and learning what attachments and intimate relationships should look like. And if we think about kind of walking back to that very first step of trust versus mistrust, if we were to see that issue, that identity task of trust versus mistrust was resolved in a manner of mistrust, suggesting that, gosh, you know, I'm not really sure that the adults in my life can be trusted. I'm not really sure that my needs will be met by my environment. You can easily see how we walk forward to our next settings with that set of beliefs and how that impacts the way that we resolve subsequent tasks. Also, those tasks increase in complexity. So as we're growing and as we're facing these psychosocial developmental tasks, we're also relying on that underlying brain development to help us get there. So it's a tricky balance and an interesting way of thinking about how teens and young adults are navigating development themselves. It's also worth noting that the adults who are in these young people's lives also have interesting developmental tasks. And the psychosocial developmental tasks for adults might include things like also developing attachments and intimate relationships, productivity and personal growth, developing our own lives and families, reflecting on what am I leaving behind, what is my legacy. So we as adults are still navigating life and addressing tasks associated with where we are. So it absolutely is worth noting that as we have our own histories and resolving tasks, that might be influencing how we show up to working with young people and even how we might interpret their behavior. I'd like to share a little bit about the work of Jeffrey Butts and his colleagues around lenses in the juvenile justice system. And he encourages us in many of his publications to think about the lenses that we're using when we're working with youth and how that impacts our practice. He talks about youth as victims, youth as villains, and youth as resources. And if we take that villain lens, oftentimes we're trying to determine what was this cause of this negative behavior. And if we take a victim lens, we might unintentionally only be focusing on the negative things that have happened to this young person in their life that might have contributed to this situation. And Jeffrey Butts and his colleagues encourage us to broaden that lens, to say, yes, in fact, you've had some trauma. Yes, in fact, you've engaged in criminal behavior, but you're a developing person with a need to belong, a love of reading, a brain that's developing. Hey, you're pretty good at sports. Your grandma's a great social support, and you're pretty funny. And if we can start to broaden our lens, which actually comes very naturally to us if you're involved in youth work, it can become very natural to kind of see the kid as the whole person. The trick then becomes making sure that seeing the kid as the whole person translates into what we're actually doing with young people. So let's talk about the victim lens a little bit more. Jeff and his colleagues would argue that if you're taking a victim lens, you might have a belief that people behave negatively because of some underlying disturbance, that there's a fundamentally different psychological or an emotional makeup that contributed to this particular behavior that we're seeing. And with that belief about that young person, people cannot change without therapy or treatment. And the primary strategy in that case for the system is therapeutic intervention, which is absolutely necessary in many cases, but may not actually address that full human being and supportive of optimal development. In the villain lens, you might believe that people behave negatively because of impulsivity, lack of self-control, and an absence of punishment, maybe even believing that there are fundamentally different motivations and impulses that are driving your behavior. And the belief there might lead to a system that believes people cannot change without strict discipline or the threat of punishment. And this is very common in correctional settings, particularly adult correctional settings. And in this case, the primary strategy might be deterrence and punishment. And in some cases, deterrence and punishment might be very effective at reducing the likelihood or the frequency of a particular behavior. But again, we have to ask ourselves, if this is our only strategy, are we actually driving towards positive youth development? They offer Resource Lens as the potential solution for optimizing development in young people who are coming into the juvenile justice system. And the Resource Lens would require that we maintain the belief that people are behaving negatively because of a normative response to an unmet need. What that means is, I have this need and I'm trying to get it met, and it's totally natural for me to try to get that need met. Unfortunately, for some of the kids that we're working with, the path that they took to get that need met obviously is one that we would consider to not be helpful for public safety and not be helpful for their development. So for youth, the need for status, belonging, autonomy, and excitement are all developmentally appropriate. The strategies that those youth used to meet that need, unfortunately, landed them in the interactions that we're having with them in our systems. If you're thinking about kids from a resource lens, you might believe that people cannot change without access to skill building opportunities and supports. And this is critical. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation around tangible examples of what this might look like. But the primary strategy when you're taking a resource lens is skill development, attachment, and belonging. So we've thought about ourselves and we've thought about how we show up and the lenses that we're looking at youth through. And now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the environment. So if you believe that, I tend to believe, and many folks would agree, that development occurs because of the interaction between the person and their environment. And that environments have a lot of impact on how we might behave and how we might choose to solve any problem that we might experience. So let's think about potential environments that youth might find themselves in our settings. If that environment includes high stress, the youth feels that they have little or no control over what might be happening to them, or perhaps little or no influence on what might be happening to them, and they don't feel that they have a caring and supportive relationship, what we notice is that we've created an environment where that emotional part of the brain that I spoke about a little bit earlier, the amygdala part of the brain, sort of gets to run the show. And we don't have an opportunity for youth to experience practicing the skills associated with the prefrontal cortex. So we lose out on the opportunity to be able to participate in my case plan, to be able to participate in problem solving, to be able to make reasonable choices. And we find ourselves almost reinforcing some of the neural pathways that are associated with the behaviors that oftentimes can lead to placement and isolation. If we think about that environment slightly differently and we start to get creative and consider our environment as an important developmental partner, and we can create environments that are low stress, and I will note that safe environments where everyone knows what the rules are absolutely lower stress than environments where no one knows what the rules are. Secondly, freedom to make reasonable choices. So the choices that we can afford kids in the environments that we have them in, where we know we can follow through and they can experience what it's like to make a choice and to explore options. Thirdly, opportunities for engagement in what's happening in my setting, and adults that I know are caring and supportive of what's happening for me. We find ourselves creating an environment where that amygdala gets to calm down a little bit, and more importantly, that frontal lobe gets an opportunity to exercise logical thinking, choices, emotion regulation, and problem solving. Those are the exact skills that are going to help kids engage in behavior that reduce the likelihood of an isolation placement. And at OIA, we've been trying to think about how do we talk about this in a way that makes sense to direct care staff. And we started thinking about the relationship between traditional responses to problem behavior and stress in kids that have a developing brain and perhaps have experienced toxic stress or complex trauma in their childhood. We started thinking about, traditional methods of power assertion or control. I give you a directive, you don't follow it. I start increasing my intensity with those directives, maybe start ratcheting up the consequences for you not following the directive, and we end up perhaps, in some cases, creating a bigger problem for ourselves. So if you're looking at the y-axis, you can see the youth's emotional response, stress or fear, goes up as we become more assertive in our approach. And the reason for that research would suggest that the reason for that is because those strategies around loss of control, a sense of loss of control on the youth's part as a consequence of that power assertion, or the mistrust of adults generally, or the fear of losing autonomy, can increase that stress and fear response, which results in behaviors where we're kind of living in the amygdala, and we see that fight-flight response occur more often. And when we're having this conversation with our direct care staff, we're not saying don't keep people safe. We're asking, what's the approach here? And is the traditional method of power assertion in this particular instance really going to get me where I need to go? Or can we think outside of the box and perhaps have different responses to kids that we sense are responding from stress and fear? Because once that stress and fear response is triggered, it can be challenging to back off of that and get kids to a place where they can emotionally regulate. And the spirit of all of this work has really been about when we see youth as resources, our primary strategies become skill development, attachment, and engagement. And I would offer that in some cases, isolation placements are necessary. If your system is exploring that, sometimes isolation placements are absolutely necessary for maintaining safety in the moment. If that is the decision that's made, what is it that we're going to do after that that focuses on skill development, attachment, and re-engagement to the community? How are we going to view this instance from a resource lens and begin to engage in those strategies that promote development? I have a brief story I'd like to share with you as we've talked about how to connect adolescent brain development to the work that we do. And we were training a group of folks, and we were talking a little bit about the brain is kind of like a muscle. The frontal lobe is a little bit like a muscle. And we were talking about many of us have gone to the gym, and the holidays roll around, you get busy, you don't go to the gym. January hits, you're back in there, you're ready to go, New Year's resolution plastered on your refrigerator. And after the first workout, your body hurts because you haven't used those muscles. You haven't gone for that run for a while. And then you realize the importance of, gosh, when I do this regularly, it's so much easier. And we started thinking about that's exactly what we need for the brain. The more opportunities that we can use decision-making, self-regulation, problem-solving skills, and find every opportunity that we can for kids to learn to use that frontal lobe and experience using that frontal lobe, the better off they're going to be, the more likely, the more easier it will come for them. So we started kind of thinking about it as a brain gym. And what does that mean for us? As we put some language around the approach that and the organizational culture that OYA is implementing, we realize that safety and security is the absolute foundation of our work. And as we dig a little bit deeper into what safety and security means, what we're after is spaces where individuals feel emotionally, psychologically safe and secure. And what does that mean? It means we feel less stress or anxiety. It means that we understand what's happening. We feel communicated with and aware of a situation. We feel comfortable expressing emotions or ideas without fear of retaliation. And interestingly, when we can provide this opportunity in these types of settings for our staff, and our staff are able to provide them for our youth, we actually have healthier developmental settings all around. The second thing that became very important on our journey to thinking about how we can provide developmentally supportive environments is caring and supportive relationships. And as we dug a little bit deeper and tried to put some language around what this means, caring is a sense of being concerned or interested. It's, hey, young person, hey, colleague, I'm concerned about your success. I'm interested in you being successful. Supportive is then the willingness to be a resource in that particular individual's journey towards their success. And relationships are really clearly defined as an association that has mutually understood boundaries that are clear and appropriate. And this obviously is paramount for youth work, where the relationship between an adult and a youth is clearly defined and appropriate with mutually understood boundaries. And that gives us a framework to operate from, where the caring and supportive piece really can be called into action. So what does that look like? Honest and authentic interactions. And if you've spent any amount of time working with young people, I don't have to tell you that they may be the very first people that call you out on your inconsistencies or your hypocrisies or any of the things that they detect as dishonest or inauthentic. And this is a really beautiful space for us to learn about how we can be more authentic as we show up on the job. Also, having interactions that are focused on meeting individuals where they are. And this actually requires that we know what their skill set is to begin with. If we go back to that resource lens and we're thinking about the primary strategies being skill development, attachment, and engagement, that in order for us to develop your skill, we have to have a really good sense of where you're operating from today, and then structure our work around that so that you have those instant successes and you can see yourself growing. Additionally, it's clear and consistent communication that is not only meaningful, but supportive. And this can be done in lots of different ways. And usually when we find ourselves delivering difficult information for folks, or perhaps information that we recognize might make someone feel uncomfortable, we can still do that in a supportive manner and reduce that intense emotional reaction. So I wanted to take another opportunity to introduce another great resource. Many of you may have found this resource on your own or through a number of different avenues. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has some very compelling work done around what does toxic stress and complex trauma look like in youth? How do we see it? How does it manifest itself? And then more importantly, when we see those things, what can we do about it? So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the types of behaviors that you might see, specifically around attachment and relationships on this first slide. That youth who've come from these types of situations have a difficult time developing strong and healthy attachments. They have difficulty controlling and expressing emotions. They may have difficulty with friendships and authority figures. And you can take this a little bit further and imagine the interactions that a youth who's experiencing these difficulties may have, and that in fact many of those interactional strategies might be the types of things that would warrant an isolation placement. So if we can back up and start to notice those things early on and work on developing some skill around what does it look like to have a healthy relationship? How can you label your own emotions, and what are the strategies for regulating that particular emotion? And finding opportunities for youth to develop trust in their friends, in their authority figures, and in themselves. Another area that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network focused on is the body and brain. So we recognize that with exposure to toxic stress and complex trauma, brain development is impaired or altered. We tend to see the pathways that are associated with fight or flight being those that are most accessible. There's a great quote that says, "What fires together wires together." And the more often that we engage in a response to a particular type of situation or stimuli, the stronger that response becomes as an option for us moving forward. Additionally, our body responses may be hypersensitive, where our experiences of physical pain and touch might be hypersensitive. And we may even have chronic physical discomfort or pain without even knowing that that's not normal. Kind of that chronic back pain that you didn't really realize you had until all of a sudden you didn't have it anymore. Recognizing that there's that body-brain connection in the youth, and all of us, but in particular the youth that we're working with, how can we develop some skill around that? Work on paraphrasing each other's responses for clarity and communication so that we can start to reduce the likelihood of engaging in fight-flight response. So this might sound like, well, what I heard you just say is that, and repeat what they said. Is that correct? Is that accurate? Encouraging body scanning to get in touch with what are you feeling right now in this moment? How can you detect the presence of emotions in your body before your brain has an opportunity to label that as something, and then you react? And that really leads us to that third bullet, which is showing some very promising results for folks, is training on meditation and mindfulness. Another area that the network has focused on is emotional responses. So for youth who've experienced chronic stress and complex trauma, they may be unpredictable or explosive in their emotional responses. Anger, sadness, avoidance, rage, low stress tolerance, where you're seeing them become easily overwhelmed. And in this way, a skill development opportunity is self-soothing activities. So they have to develop that ability to regulate. The interesting thing here is, if I'm going to develop the ability to regulate my emotions, I do have to have a few opportunities where my emotions become very elevated so that I can practice that skill in bringing those emotions down and in regulating that intensity down. So as folks who are working with these kids, having a level of comfort with some of those intense emotional responses and then supporting that youth as they are re-regulating themselves is the most important place where that learning can occur. Another skill development opportunity is stress management, making a list of what you've got to do, taking a few deep breaths. Let's take this problem and focus one thing at a time. These are actually wonderful skills for all of us to be learning. The network also talks a little bit about behavior, recognizing that these youth tend to be easily triggered, have poor self-regulation. They may appear as detached or disengaged. They may, and often do, have an increased risk of engaging in behavior that's not supportive of their development. And in this way, we can raise awareness of their triggers. Let's talk a little bit about what's getting you so upset in these moments. And then how can we regulate that emotion down for you? Strategies for them to use to communicate when they are on emotion overload. There's some great resources, flipping the lid, which many of you have seen as a strategy for understanding when my frontal lobe has come totally offline and I'm being ruled by my amygdala. How can I recognize that and ask for help? Taking 5. So how many of us just need to step away and take 5 deep breaths, and showing you that can be a great strategy for managing emotion overload. Cause and effect of individual behavior through hypothetical scenarios and role plays. Again, the big bulk of learning comes through experience, and role play is one way to get that experience so that as they walk into a situation where it is very real, they can rely on that role play as a reference point for how they might approach a particular situation. The network also talks about cognition, so problems with thinking, reasoning, and problem solving, which shouldn't be surprising to us as we know that the prefrontal cortex is still developing in adolescence and well into early adulthood. They struggle to think ahead or anticipate the future. We absolutely know this to be true in many of the youth that we're working with. But for kids who experienced a lot of complex trauma and a lot of toxic stress, they may in fact only be focused on their basic survival in any given situation and have an extremely difficult time sustaining attention on what we might refer to as the bigger picture. So how can we skill develop for these types of behaviors? If we can find ways to engage in meaningful activities that are balanced in both planning and participating, some of those skills with future focus and anticipating outcomes can start to develop. Gradual increases in time required to focus. And so recognizing that you're dealing with a youth who really may not be able to sustain attention for very long, but gradually moving that needle on how long they can stay focused and sustain their attention. And then finding opportunities for hypothetical thinking. And one of the great questions we can ask, so how might we solve this problem? If a youth's coming to you with a concern or a grievance, just asking that question gives them space to practice those skills. And if they don't get opportunities to practice those skills, we certainly won't see them developing. And lastly, from the network, self-concept and future orientation. And I know that many of us have worked with youth directly for all of our careers, some of us, and we've seen the youth who really lack a sense of self-worth, who lack hope, who feel that they are not in control of their future, that everyone is out to get me, that there's just no point in me trying. And that can be such a hard place to start from. So some skill development opportunities, if we're taking that resource lens, recognizing adolescent brain development, recognizing the role of trauma, can be to build that self-efficacy and self-esteem. This is such a beautiful cycle because if you've ever tried really hard to do something and just put all of your blood, sweat, and tears into trying to learn something or achieve something or actually learn a new thing, and you finally did it, you probably experienced a great boost to your self-esteem. And that self-esteem that increase felt great. And you probably walked into the next challenge or new thing, having a sense of efficacy that, you know what, if I try hard enough, if I put enough effort into this, I will probably be successful at it. And that high level of self-efficacy continues to support high levels of self-esteem. So it becomes this beautiful cycle that sustains us in maintaining a level of self-worth and confidence in our capabilities. Another skill development opportunity is those basic self-care skills that will bring a sense of value, self-respect to kids and to ourselves. Developing reasonable goals and a sense of purpose, we really can't underestimate the impact and importance of purpose in young people's lives, and giving them some space to articulate that and to draft sort of the plan for what their purpose might be and how they would get there. And then lastly, identifying what is within your control and what is not. And oftentimes we can find ourselves, if we go back to our victim, villain, and resource lens, we can find ourselves putting ourselves in that victim role, that in fact, I don't have any control, when in fact, we may have control over our own, we do have control over our own behaviors and our own thoughts and our own feelings. So how can we work on tapping into that, what is within my control and what is not, and then engaging in healthier strategies moving forward? So the reason why we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the places that these kids are coming from is that many of the concerns that we just walked through are the very behaviors that can contribute to youth's behaviors that are likely to lead to isolation. So trying to take this contextual view of what's driving the need for us to think about using isolation as an option for kids, and then how do we come up with some different strategies for addressing that so that we don't have to get to the point where we're using isolation. And we are ensuring youth safety from a developmental perspective. I want to talk for a little bit about supporting staff in skill development. And what we've learned, and I know Ruth will be talking about this in detail for us in a few moments, is that creating new language is very important. Understanding that, making sure that we're all on the same page about what it means to have developing kids as our primary population. Reinforcing that new mindset at every opportunity. And then, just as we're providing opportunities for skill development and practice for our youth, we also need to do that for our staff, and really recognizing that this is a parallel process for youth and staff. What we were after in Oregon is confident, competent, and capable staff who receive training and ongoing coaching with these topics, where we can structure activities for youth and staff to engage in that have goals, and ensure that staff also have the resources that they need to be successful in this work. If we're going to ask them to do this work with youth, we also need to be prepared to provide them with the resources and do this work with our workforce. The third element of environments that I wanted to speak about today before I turn it over to my co-presenter is on high expectations and accountability. This is cornerstone for the work that we do as public safety organizations. And so it's worth defining what those terms mean. And for OYA, we have defined expectations as that I have a belief that someone will or should achieve something. So I believe in you. I've got this expectation and I know you can do it. But we also want to be mindful that our expectations must be reasonable and rising. And this really relates to that point from earlier about meeting youth where they are. I have to understand the skill level that you're operating from today and set expectations that are both reasonable and rising, and support you on your journey to meeting those expectations all along the way. Accountability can be a squishy term for us to really define, and we searched high and low for a definition that would resonate with our mission as a public safety organization who ensures youth accountability for their behaviors, but that also spoke to, accountability is an internal state in many cases. So our definition is a quality or state that's characterized by a willingness to accept responsibility for their actions. And we believe at OYA, and I think you'll detect this from Ruth's presentation as well, that our interactions in our environment have a huge influence on whether or not youth are going to assume accountability for themselves and their behavior. But true accountability is that I'm holding myself to a standard. And that's the kinds of environments that we want to see for kids. And we definitely believe that in order for us to see that kind of development, we need to focus on some of the tools and practices every interaction, every time, and really getting ourselves to a place where we recognize that we have an opportunity to develop in every interaction, and the more that we can learn about how things are working and not working, the more we can promote overall youth development in our facilities, and ultimately avoid or significantly reduce our need to use isolation for youth who are engaging in some of the most challenging behaviors that we see. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ruth for the second half of our presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Ruth, are you unmuted?
Whoops, sorry, technical difficulties.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you, Shannon. That was great. So I'm going to speak about the work that the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services has been doing over the past 5 to 10 years to try to incorporate positive youth development into our daily work with young people. Oh, whoops, she was crazy. All right, so we identified the need to have the voice of young people in programming to create some buy-in from them. We have done a lot of training with our staff because it's a real balance of sharing power appropriately or allowing for young people to have input based on the competencies that we see them to have. So practicing youth voice and practicing their helping to guide decisions is a really important aspect in our programs. We want to solicit input appropriately, and we create opportunities for that, whether it's community meetings or in allowing for a youth council where 1 or 2 young people represent the interests of the other kids and bring that to the attention of the program leadership. We're encouraging our staff to model appropriate adult interactions and to, with appropriate boundaries, talk about their own interests and options, or using volunteers to bring in other opportunities. I think one of the things we see is that our young people, based on their history and their communities that they come from, have not had a lot of exposure to some of the opportunities that would allow them to see themselves from a position of having abilities or competencies. And so we look for opportunities inside our programs to offer these exposures, whether it's to the arts or music or interests, or building on some of the life skills that we hope that they would master as they move towards transitioning out of our system. You know, financial literacy, cooking, different things that you wouldn't typically think of happening in a juvenile facility, but if you really start to think about it, there are a number of opportunities for that to happen. So one of the things we're really focused on is youth outcomes in terms of, you know, educational attainment, vocational placements. Once kids are back out into the community, we're interested in maintaining safe environments, which is something Shannon spoke about extensively in the beginning of the presentation. In order for us to create buy-in from our staff, we really had to show them that making these changes in the way we approached our work was not going to jeopardize their safety. And in fact, that if we have relationships with young people and they're willing to express what some of their concerns are, that we could possibly manage better inside the programs, that our staff are safer too, and that their stress is reduced. We have moved for the past 4 years to an incentive-based behavior management program, which I'll speak about more in detail, but rather than constantly taking things away from young people and using punishment as our only tool with them, we've looked at ways to get buy-in from young people and some not very elaborate strategies, but getting kids to see that if they participate and if they are willing to work with us around managing their own behavior, that there is a benefit to them. We have adopted dialectical behavioral therapy, which was based in Marshall Linehan's work as one of our main clinical interventions with young people. And we see a number of advantages to that. That speaks a lot to mindfulness and emotional regulation, which Shannon talked about earlier. And it's really teaching kids pretty concrete skills to manage their emotions and ideally then manage their behavior. One of the other advantages we see is that the way we use DBT, we teach it in groups, and we use our direct care staff as co-facilitators for that. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from our staff that they transfer the skills they learn at work into their own personal life in terms of how do they manage stress and emotions. So that's been an advantage for us. We have created, because in these complex environments with kids with these complicated histories, not every kid responds as rapidly as you want. We've developed an individual service plan, which is we bring the program team together to look at a kid who seems to be struggling, has assaultive behavior, really is not listening to staff direction, not willing to participate in programming, doesn't want to go to school. We'll identify, try to do a comprehensive look at what seems to trigger the behavior, what are some responses that we might be able to use to be more effective, and then we make sure that everyone who's working with the young person has the same understanding of what our strategies are. We have a very firm position on release from confinement. We want to include the young people and also the staff that were involved in the decision to put a kid in his room. We want that same person to be involved in the transition out. And when we do training around our whole restraint, de-escalation, and defensive disengagement in terms of how if we have to physically manage a young person, we also think about, as soon as you put a kid in his room, you should be thinking about how are you going to be able to release them back into the program. Because in our system, we do not use confinement as a punishment or a consequence for the behavior, but strictly for the time necessary to get the kid's behavior under control and make sure they're safe and the staff and the other young people are safe. We have a really deep commitment to using our staff as advocates and coaches for the young people. And every young person has one particular staff who's assigned as their advocate, and that person has to spend individual time with them at least once a week, and ideally more often than that, where they're checking in about, are there any concerns the young person has, give them some feedback if they're doing well, and trying to be an anchor for them in the program. So we emphasize the skill development for our staff, and we start that conversation when they begin their employment, and we offer opportunities throughout their time to enhance those skills. We're looking to model relationships that are developmentally appropriate, because we feel that shows a young person that, there's another way to manage conflict or to problem solve. And we hope that those skills will be transferable to the young people. We stress the need for guidance on balancing appropriate boundaries. We tell them you don't need to tell them what you did this weekend, just that you had a nice weekend. We want to provide a framework for conversations because we feel that's one, and that also we believe really adds to safety, that the young people develop some sense of trust with the adults, and they feel that they can go to them to mediate disputes or to raise a concern or to let us know that they're not feeling safe, a variety of situations. So this comes from the Search Institute, which Shannon referenced earlier, but they have a lot of great material that you're probably familiar with. But one of the key roles the staff play and where we want to coach them is around how exactly can you build a relationship with a young person who comes somewhat guarded and not open to that. And for many of our direct care staff, this is their first job or their first foray into working with young people, and they're looking for some guidance on that. So we found this material to be helpful, that we're expressing care and concern for the young people, that, you know, when our staff are working, that they're present, they're attentive to what's going on, they have a sense of situational awareness, that they're going to invest some time in young people, and that they're consistent and dependable. You know, we say that old adage about say what you do and do what you say. That's one of the things that we stress with our staff. Challenging growth, the idea that we're not, positive youth development is not just conceding everything that young people want. We need to hold people accountable. There are, you know, rules in the program that young people make decisions to follow or not follow, and then they're responsible for the consequences of that. We really try to message that we see potential in every young person. It's obviously different for every young person, but that they could have a different future, and we want to see if they could envision what the possible might be. Giving them support, leading by example, advocating, giving them feedback. One of the things we see with our direct care staff is encouraging them to use an opportunity to tell a young person when they did something well. You know, like, oh, I saw that, you know, John was upset and you went over and told him, you know, that you were supportive. Yeah, I'm not talking like the kids do, but the kids can, you know, be caught doing something good and then recognized for that. This is one of the more complicated ones, sharing power inside a facility that has a lot of rules and locks, but treating kids fairly, looking for their opinion, recognizing their needs, collaborating to try to help them make their goals, and include them in a decision-making at an appropriate level. In some of our treatment programs where kids are there longer and we have a lot of time with them, you know, we'll have a youth council that's very involved in developing perhaps new rules or a new incentive system in the program, or mediating disputes. And so there's a real robust opportunity for young people to make their opinion heard and influence what's going on. In some of our programs where young people are there for a shorter amount of times and we don't have the ability to skill up the kids all the way, we still might say from the kitchen, which, you know, here's a week's worth of meals. What, you know, is there one that you don't like? Or what should the movie be tonight? We have these 2 movies. Which one do you want to pick? So that they're practicing expressing their opinion and making a decision, obviously in a very small way, but it's somewhat representative of the idea that they have a voice. We like to give them opportunities to learn new things, and we're lucky to have a lot of interest from various groups in our communities where they want to come in and interact with our young people, but teaching them about what's possible. You know, a lot of our young people discover that they have a lot of artistic talent and ability, or they learn about music or making beats and recording things, or different things that they expressed an interest with, and we try to provide the exposure that would be helpful. So what I'm sure most of the jurisdictions with us today, isolation is really is a challenge to manage. It's a challenge for us every day, and we try to be very vigilant about it. But it's obviously a response to fights, assaults, and physical aggression. When there's a threat or some posturing that makes the staff feel like there's an imminent risk for injury or harm to someone else. Destruction of property, sometimes it's used as a cooling off period to ensure that youth are safe, both the youth that was involved and then the other youth in the group. And sometimes it's a consequence for a rule violation. So for us, we've done a lot of work on our restraint technique and teaching our staff defensive disengagement. We have only one restraint technique so that we hopefully are all practicing it at the same time. But, I don't think one response fits every single situation, but we train everyone in it in their beginning of their employment, and we have an annual recertification, which I'm sure many of you or all of you do, around what is the technique. And I think one of the things we see is that at some locations we have very few restraints, and then the staff who do have to respond sometimes are a little rusty, versus another place where it's a more routine event to have to restrain someone. We do a lot of work around de-escalation. We have a lot of our staff trained in motivational interviewing, which we've found to be very helpful. But we stress situational awareness with our staff. So, if you're in a large room with, the whole group of young people, that you're paying attention to the dynamic and, is there something that you should call a kid, to the side and ask him if there's something going on, or move them from the main audience and try to de-escalate it and understand what the problem is. We have had some success using mediation to involve the kids in problem solving. We've trained our staff, and we've talked about actually training the young people to mediate disputes, but we haven't got to that point yet. We do a lot of information collection in terms of the relationships between various gangs in our state and what, just how to be vigilant about what are the current tensions. We don't segregate by gang, like have one group in one program and the other group in another one. We keep them mixed together, but we do a lot of data collection around different conflicts, and we include that information in our client information system so that people can track have there been disputes between the different people, or, some of the events and tragedies that take place out in the city or the community makes, obviously the kids know about it, and then we're trying to be very attentive to what's going on there and what is there some proactive work we can do around that. So now in terms of using these tools to effectively interact with youth to reduce isolation. So this comes from Shannon's work with the Oregon Youth Authority, but identifying reasonable choices that kids can make in moments of stress. Having a sense of control is very important. For us, that's DBT. There are certain skills that have little code names like Wise Mind or Teflon Mind that the kids, they know them, and the staff will say, hey, what about Wise Mind? So there's the idea that you teach kids skills, help them make choices, and then help them identify, whoa, this is a time when that might be really helpful for me. So, and there's that example in terms of, do you want to take a walk outside? Sit in a quiet space? What would be a helpful break from what's going on? We want to give kids opportunities to learn these skills when they're not escalated, and then practice and help them identify this is an opportunity to use that skill during a stressful period. And there's, once again, the flipping your lid example that we used earlier. We're working towards avoiding confinement when a kid becomes escalated. I think when a kid is escalated, then you're locking them in the space. It's adding another level of stress to what the kid's experiencing, but obviously it is necessary sometimes. But the need for situational awareness, intervening early, you know, traditional, more authoritarian responses sometimes continue the escalation. Sometimes in our programs, you know, staff will step in for one another. If, you know, one person doesn't seem to be really getting through to the young person, we'll have them tap out and have someone else kind of see if they might be able to reason with the young person in a fresh start on the conversation. But trying to give reasonable choices whenever possible. And so it's important to understand your facility. I know each one is different, and one space may not have an awful lot of like alcove space where you might be able to take a kid to the side, but kind of understanding what spaces you do have, and is that something that would work in your setting. So we feel it's really important around teaching staff to use de-escalation. And Shannon talked about that earlier in terms of, you know, trying to make sure the kid understands that you're trying to understand how they feel or what they think or what has caused this to get to this point. The ability to ask them to take a minute, you know, that, I mean, that can happen in a classroom and you want to ask them to step outside, or if they got very agitated in a larger group of young people, you want to see, you know, what's your best intervention. Looking at the skills that each young person has, and reminding them, reminding of things, you know, incentives, you know, you're I don't know, your family's coming this weekend, you want to be able to tell them that, you know, you're still on, you know, the privilege level or whatever kind of angle you can play with each young person, that they do have these skills and they may not always choose to use them, but we hope that they're available, you know, in their toolbox, so to speak. Obviously removing the audience, because a lot of times the kids don't feel like they can back down in front of the other young people. And so they're going to keep it going versus kind of getting them away from the audience and that added incentive to misbehave. Making sure there's good communication with coworkers for support, both in managing the situation and then sometimes afterwards when you want to process what happened. We do try to look at, could we have done something differently, especially you know, if it gets to be a really physical confrontation, are there other ways that we might have managed it? We usually always offer a young person the opportunity to be escorted away from the group instead of having immediately to go to a restraint. Sometimes kids will take that opportunity, sometimes they won't, and it leads to a restraint, but we use that as a middle ground with a lot of the situations that present themselves. So for us, I said earlier, you know, as soon as we put a young person in a room, we're trying to figure out what's a reasonable release plan for them. So we manage it right there in the program. Usually whoever is the most responsible or senior person who is there, but we don't have a director 24/7. So sometimes it's the shift supervisor who's the person. We found it's very important for staff buy-in to make sure that the person who is involved in the confinement is also at least consulted on the release. They are not necessarily the person who decides, because sometimes they might still be rather agitated themselves and they feel like they want to still try to control the situation. But if you just have someone who comes in and says, yeah, let them out of their room, and disempower the staff that was involved in it in the first place, it's not productive. So we have some structured guidelines about in the moment assessment, risk to escalate. Are they, you know, a lot of times young people we'll take them out of their room, but we will not have them return to the rest of the group. And they have consequences for their behavior, and they may have some repairs, which ties back into the dialectical behavioral therapy. That's one of the concepts, that you're making this repair to the community, and because you've done something that disrupted the community, which is that. So we're watching the young person to see whether they've regained control of their behavior. We start to process about what happened. We'll do an assessment of our staff in terms of who's the best person to talk to this young person, now that, you know, we're trying to measure whether or not they're back in control of their behavior, and that they can participate in a reasonable discussion, you know, and based on the relationships and also on the roles of the people that were involved in the confinement. We want to pick sort of the most productive staff relationships. But we do require the kids to process the event, speak to their role, identify their options to avoid recurrence, and also, you know, to take some responsibility for that. And once again, DBT comes into our system in terms of, there's an activity called the mini chain, which I'd be happy to provide more information about, but it's really the kid kind of assessing, you know, how did this go off the rails kind of thing from their perspective. And they're able, most times kids can say what the adults did that fed into the situation, as well as what they did. And then, you know, we try to process that and, you know, help kids to look at things a little bit more objectively, and perhaps, you know, from a less emotional response about, you know, they just asked you to take your seat for dinner, you know, and then it was a huge dispute in the dining room that was kind of unnecessary. So if a kid is a history of confinement and problematic behavior in particular, we have like an individual release plan for that particular kid. So we break it down into really small steps, that, you know, you may leave the kid in his room, but leave the door open and they can keep talking to one of the staff. We have clinical staff that are part of the milieu, and so they're available to come as a third party sometimes and talk to the young person, or one of the program director or the assistant director. Some of the young people, we have to create a contract for safety. That could be the young person's safety, or it could be, you know, other people's safety. We may do some individualized programming for the young person. They're out of their room, but they can't be in the group and don't participate at the same time in the activities of the program. And we do use mediation when we feel it is, if the young person's open to that. And, you know, we might bring that topic up a number of times. So this is just a slide that I believe shows. So these are some of our important data points: assaults on young people, assaults on staff, restraints, and use of confinement, as well as, I think we have our suicide. No, we don't have that. All right, so our restraint line is going down. Our use on staff assault line is pretty steady, a little up and down, and room confinement is a little bit on the decline. So I think that is one thing. If you're contemplating making changes in this area, it's important to try to get a baseline for where you started, understand what are the important outcomes for all your stakeholders, so the young people, your staff, as well as your leadership. what are you working towards? And then as you measure it, you'll be able to evaluate exactly how is it going. So this is a little bit more. I said earlier that we developed a more of an incentive-based behavior management system. One of the things we learned was that when leadership thinks that you should do this and you impose it from on high, it's not as effective as if you include all your stakeholders, starting with the staff at every level and in every role, and then eventually including young people. That was where we first saw our most remarkable success. So we have included DBT in the construct for behavior management, because we talk a lot to young people about emotional regulation, distress tolerance. We tied in the role of staff as advocates in using those contacts with young people to identify and strengthen positive behavior and help process situations where a young person seems to be struggling. I referenced this before, but we have like a menu of repairs, we call it, which is how do you put it back together with people when you had an incident that was distressing at the least, and can be harmful to some people in the worst case scenario. So depending on the young person and their infraction, so to speak, they have the opportunity to make a repair, and they are kind of in a neutral state with us in that they're not going to resume any privileges or full activities until they do make a repair. And it could be, depending on the young person, it could be an apology, it could be some type of chore or maintenance activity, or could be doing a lot of different things within the program. And all those options were created by the programs themselves, which we think demonstrated their buy-in in the idea. But and as I referenced before, when we have kids who have sustained difficulties, we create this individualized service plan, which asks our staff to really cue in on small behavioral changes for young people to see, do you see a pattern? Do you see that a young person's, starting to deteriorate in terms of their ability to function in the program? And is there a way to intervene successfully? What triggers it? And I'm sure you've all had experience where young people like, well, it's when I have a phone call, or it's when my family doesn't come on a time when they could visit, or it's when these kids from another gang are in the building, or, everything is unique and individualized. And then how do you try to plan for that? We do use a community meeting. We have a standard weekly community meeting, and we work hard to make sure young people understand they can bring their concerns and that there's definitely a place for their voice there. We try to do a lot of work with our staff around the lens of fairness, which is a challenge when you want to look at the unique individual needs of each young person, but you want to be able to make a few small adjustments for some kids, but also through the lens of fairness. Can we explain the rules of the program in a way that makes sense to young people? Do we apply the rules very fairly? Do we show bias in what we're doing? And that is hard work, because we're all human, and not everyone shows up to work with the same energy and objectivity every day. And so, we try to check each other on that. We did include young people and staff in developing our incentives and rewards menu. And it's interesting what young people are motivated for. I mean, it could just be, you know, 15 minutes with a staff, their favorite staff, so to speak, you know, to play cards, or, you know, sometimes it's food, they want an extra muffin, or we happen to be able to engage our kitchen into, like, once a week, kids on a certain level the kitchen will make them, within reason, a special. I think breakfast is probably our best one, because there's, you know, breakfast is not an expensive meal, but maybe like you get special staff breakfast on Saturdays if you make a certain level. So I think a lot of times the staff have some really good ideas about how to do that. And like I said, recognition is free. We have a lot of certificates in our programs. You're the student of the week. You're the group member of the week. You're the most improved. I don't know if we have that one, but so there's a lot of things that we do, and you know, we post them, and everybody knows who's what. But so we have these opportunities to encourage positive participation. I mean, there are certain standards that everyone, you know, has recreation time, everyone has school, everyone has clinical services, but, you know, there are opportunities within the program day to create other small opportunities for that. And in our system, when you have difficulties, you don't lose everything you earned. You're more in a neutral situation where you can't earn any more, and you can't use the ones you did earn, but you don't lose them, because sometimes that's a very self-defeating process for young people. It's like they get to the highest level, and then they lose something, and then they're like, well, forget it. I'm not gonna do this. And it's just kind of spirals out of control. So we found this to work for us, for sure. Once again, I talked about this a little bit, but so we have repairs, so a way to make a repair or to make amends to the community. And the more serious the infraction, the more significant the repair. And we consider violence against other young people or staff as the most serious. We also have, you know, it's not an automatic referral to law enforcement in Massachusetts for behavior inside an institution, but we support our staff if they want to press charges. And we caution every young person when they come in as part of their intake that any violence against others could be prosecuted. And we make them sign something that says they understand that. So we're at least, you know, trying to be very direct with them in the beginning. And we in our we do two things in Massachusetts. We do pretrial detention for kids awaiting trial, and then we have post-adjudication. For the post-adjudication kids, we have control over their release within the agency. And so we also have the ability to do some review and possibly extend young people's time inside a program or facility where we, and there's a due process piece to it, but we do use that opportunity in certain circumstances. I said that. So we try to make sure that the expectations are clear to young people from the very beginning in terms of behavior, and that they understand what the possible incentives are, and then also what the consequences are. And you know, we try to bring that up regularly with them so they're aware of that, and we talk to them about their rights, because safety is really important to us. So we tell that to the young people, that while they're with us, we want them to be safe. We want other young people to be safe, and we certainly want our staff to be safe. And that is a real consistent theme in terms of how we message what we want to have happen inside the program. So, like I said, we've been doing this for about 8 years. And in the beginning, we have a unionized workforce. and the union would frequently say that positive youth development meant please youth daily. And that is not actually true, but that was sort of their perspective, that we were completely abdicating and allowing kids to do whatever they want to do. So there was a lot of challenge in the beginning. I think some of it was the result of people not understanding that there can be accountability as well as strength focus to young people in the justice system. So that cultural shift is ongoing. We've done a lot of work on training to help staff understand what does PYD look like on the floor, you know, on second shift, on a Tuesday night. What does that actually look like? We've developed some materials around that, which we'd be happy to share. But I think one of the things is about our culture that we've worked on, which is getting our staff to see that justice-involved young people deserve the same things that any young person deserves. You know, a good education, opportunity to build skills, competencies to be successful adults. If we do our job correctly, then, you know, our young people go on to become taxpayers and job holders and citizens. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges to that, but we really are working to see what potential each young person has and then what can the system do to support them. Strength-based, there's a lot of nuance to it, and it doesn't always come naturally to our workforce anyway. And so we do a lot of work in shift change when you know, about staff identifying what went well for each young person, what was a challenge, how do we, you know, build more on the positives, getting people to understand that rewards are not contraindicated if you're trying to get rid of negative behavior. It can be very challenging. We've had to look at do we have natural allies in this conversation? In our system, for example, this kind of thinking change came much more naturally to our clinical staff and our educators. So how do we engage them, because they're there on the floor with our direct care staff. There are some of our staff who are much more open to it and early adopters, and we're actually really excited about it. One of the concepts we've been using is the champion of PYD, like locally, people that are really interested in it and want to get, you know, it gives them an opportunity to develop their own competencies, to kind of build their resume about I was involved in this and I helped with this. And there's been some good response, and we're winning some of our staff over more and more every day. So things to consider if you're going to contemplate any of these ideas is your marketing strategy. Where is there resistance? And we have resistance. So, you know, how do you sell this to staff? How do you bring their skills up to the level where they feel like they're competent to be able to take care of the details that are involved in this? We stress the idea that institutional safety is based on young people feeling safe, respected, and engaged. And we have, you know, at the very least, our data tells us that when we went to using this approach, things certainly didn't get worse, and some things got better. So that's, once again, where data is really important about telling the story and what is it we're going to measure. And then looking at, starting with small wins and recognizing that and publicizing as much as possible. I got 1 minute, I think. So be intentional. Resistance is there for a reason, so find out why. and stay focused on your vision and let people learn as you go, and accept that you're going to make mistakes because we're human. Thank you. No.
All right. Thank you very much, Shannon and Ruth, both. That was a lot of very useful and incredible information that you provided to everybody. And again, thank you both so much for all the time and effort that you put into your presentations. I think everybody on the webinar should find the information very useful. We don't have any time for any questions, so what I would like to suggest is, if anybody out there, if you do have questions, you can see on the final slide there, you have Sharon's email. You could email your questions directly to her. And either of us will be happy to provide a response to your questions, and even solicit some additional information from either Shannon or Ruth. So again, thank you all very much for your time and for participating in today's webinar. And we look forward to having you join us on our next webinar. So thank you all very much.